Hello everyone. Fall is here, and that means the harvest and holidays. I can't think of a better culinary way to bring these three things together than by making pies. So I'm going to show you a very simple lattice apple pie preparation. Now the first question always has to be, well, what kind of apples should I use for making apple pie? I've got a couple examples here that I'll show you. First one is a Macintosh apple. Now these are preferred because their balance of sweetness to a pleasant acidity is very, very nice. Their structure is also such that it doesn't break down and go to mush very easily under duress of heating or baking. Granny Smith apples we know very, very well. They're everywhere in the culinary world for baking and cooking preparations. Very straightforward, tart acetic acid, unmistakable, and a structure that also is very rigid and won't break down under heating or cooking or baking very well. The third one I have is a personal preference. It's Honeycrisp apple. Now I like this one because its flavor profile between the sweetness and the acidity I think works really well against baking spices such as cinnamon or allspice or nutmeg. So I'm going to go ahead and use it in this one. The Red Delicious apple, it's not a very preferential apple for apple pie because it's more of an eating apple. Its flavor is not so prevalent to really stand out in an apple pie, and its structure is such that it goes to mush really easily when it's cooked. So the recipe I'm going to make today has 2 Granny Smith apples, 1 Honeycrisp, and 2 Macintosh. The pie crust we're going to use is actually a pre-made pie crust that we can purchase through our distributor. Now later on in the video I'll have a basic 1, 2, 3 pie dough recipe that I'll show you that we're going to use for the lattice work on top of our pie. You could use the same dough if you wanted to make your own crust.
Our mise en place is going to consist of our chosen apples, our frozen pie crust, all-purpose flour, granulated sugar, our spice mix of salt, cinnamon, and nutmeg, light brown sugar, and butter cubes. First we'll start by peeling all the skin from the apples. Next we'll remove all the core material and seeds. Slice the apples about 1/8 of an inch thin. The thinner, the better. Once our apples are sliced, we'll go ahead and add our all-purpose flour, granulated sugar, our salt, cinnamon, and nutmeg mix, our light brown sugar, and our butter cubes. Then we'll give everything a good mix to incorporate all the ingredients evenly. Once we remove our still frozen pie shell from the freezer, we'll go ahead and add our pie filling, distributing evenly, packing it as densely as we can, and we'll pile it about 1 inch higher in the center than the crust is at the edge. This is going to settle a little bit during baking and we'll lose some height. For the lattice topping, we're going to make a 1, 2, 3 pie dough. This will consist of 3 parts by weight all-purpose flour, 2 parts by weight cold cube butter, and 1 part by volume ice water. With a bench scraper, we'll begin to cut the butter into the flour, cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces while still keeping it cold. We'll add a pinch of salt just to give our dough its own flavor, and then continue to cut until our butter is about the size of small peas. This should produce a mealy type of pie dough. Now we'll begin to add moisture to our dough by incorporating ice water. The temperature of the ice water will help keep the butter from getting too soft. In a little bit we'll add some more ice water and keep working it until we reach a dough-like consistency. We'll make sure to collect all our small dough fragments that have accumulated on the table, and then we'll allow our dough to rest in the refrigerator so that it can regain some cold temperature. To roll out our dough, we'll begin by dusting parchment paper with a little bit of all-purpose flour. We'll then place our dough over the flour, and dust that with a little bit more flour, and then fold the parchment paper over the dough. With a rolling pin, we'll begin to gradually roll the dough out into a disc about 1/4 of an inch thick. We want to be sure that the dough doesn't overly stick to the parchment paper. We do want it loose. So at different points, we'll peel back the parchment to make sure it's not sticking. If that is the case, we'll dust with a little bit more all-purpose flour, as we can brush this away later if necessary. Once we've ensured that the dough is not sticking to either side of the parchment, we'll continue to gradually enlarge the disc. Once again, we'll move the dough back into the refrigerator to make sure that it remains stiff and the butter does not get too soft. Now that our dough has cooled down sufficiently, we'll give it one more roll just to even out thickness. We'll also make sure that neither side is sticking to the parchment paper. Now we're ready to prepare our lattice strips. With a straight edge, like the edge of a half sheet pan, and a pizza wheel, we'll cut 1/2-inch strips from one side of our dough to the other. To begin our over-under lattice pattern, we'll begin by placing 3 strips of our dough running parallel with a little bit of space between them over the top of the pie. The next strip will be placed perpendicular to the original 3 at one edge of the pie. We'll then place 2 strips in the spaces that we left when we placed the first original 3 pieces of dough. Now we'll fold back our 3 original strips and place our next strip of dough perpendicular to the 2 that remain. When we replace the original 3 pieces of dough, we can begin to see our over-under pattern begin to form. Now we'll alternate folding back dough and placing more perpendicular pieces of dough. Once we've completed our lattice work, with a knife we'll trim off any overhanging flange, and then with our thumbs and fingers we'll crimp the lattice dough and pinch it into the original pie crust. Finally, we'll brush the entire top of the dough with an egg wash, and then we'll sprinkle either granulated sugar, rock sugar, or sugar in the raw over the top to give that granulated effect. Next up is a preheated 375-degree conventional oven or a 325-degree convection oven for approximately 30 minutes. And here's our finished apple pie, ready to be sliced up and served with our favorite cinnamon chantilly whipped cream, or perhaps a scoop of salted caramel ice cream.
All right, everybody, thanks for watching and happy baking.